12. While fare-free policies do increase ridership, comma, they have not been found to be an effective way to address traffic problems. So here we have an opening subordinate clause, dependent clause. The word but here is not necessary to connect a dependent clause to an independent. We can actually just use a comma. And so I'm happy with just a comma here. That's good for choice C. Can't use a conjunction. Can't use a conjunction. In fact, B is a fragment. If we try to connect these two sentences together, we wouldn't have any complete sentence. And D, we can't use that because the first part of the sentence before the semicolon is not complete. So we go with C because we absolutely can do incomplete, comma, complete, connecting our sentences with a comma. And typically when we have that subordinating conjunction and that subordinate or dependent clause to start, we want to use a comma to separate it from the complete sentence to follow. So we get choice C. 13, which choice is the most effective version of the underlined portion? So let's read the sentence. Not surprisingly, public transportation is used by more people when people do not have to pay a fare. In order to know whether this works or not, or whether the other choices are better, we have to see how this sentence starts out this paragraph. So let's read. According to a report by the Center for Urban Transportation Research, public transit systems that abolish fares typically see a short-term increase in ridership of about 50%. So the very next sentence talks about how when you get rid of fares, people use the public transportation systems more. And so that seems to actually work pretty well with A. So let's hold on A, see if we can find anything better. B, more people use public transportation if they do not have to pay a fare. I have to say, comparing A versus B, B is actually looking a little stronger. I mean, the content is the same for both of them, but it's a little shorter. If you look at A, it repeats people by more people when people do not have to pay a fare. It's a little redundant. It sounds a little awkward. So A versus B, I'm definitely liking B here. How about C? If people do not have to pay a fare, more of those people use public transportation. Wordy, again, it's repeating people. Not surprisingly, using public transportation is done by more people when they do not have to pay a fare. I mean, yeah, it works, not terrible, but compared to B, this is where principle 4 comes in. All things being equal, shorter is better. B is nice and condensed, nice and concise. Nothing repetitive, nothing redundant, nothing wordy, nothing awkward. So it's one of those cases where shorter is better. That's really the tiebreaker that helps out a lot, in particular on this question. So we get B. 14 is a tricky one. So this is all about sentence structure. So we look at the first part of the sentence. All of this green up to the semicolon in the original. This is actually an independent clause. Well, technically, two independent clauses connected together. So just a complete sentence, ultimately. Then we have the semicolon, and we can use the semicolon if what follows is a complete sentence. The problem is this word as makes this sentence subordinate or dependent, makes it not a complete standalone sentence. So for that reason, using a semicolon here, or a period actually, looking at A and D, using a semicolon or a period here is not appropriate because I can only use those if I'm separating two complete sentences with either that semicolon or that period, but the second sentence here is not complete, so those are out. What about B and C? Well, B and C, one of the things to notice is I'm deleting the as. So the problem with C could have worked if there were an as there. It would be a little bit more doable because there you'd be connecting a complete and an incomplete. But as soon as you delete the as you do in choice C, the sentence after the comma is now complete. And now I've got two complete sentences separated by just a comma, and that's a comma splice. That's incorrect. Even if it sounds good, even if it feels like it flows, it's a comma splice. It's not correct. So what about the colon? Can you use a colon? Remember, the rule for the colon, you must have a complete sentence before it, which we do. We've established that. And then basically you can have anything after it, as long as it's explaining, emphasizing, or elaborating something in the first part of the sentence. And here it is. It is describing or showing more information about how car use has only slightly declined. And you absolutely can have two complete sentences separated by just a colon, or by a colon. That works because you can pretty much have anything after that colon. It doesn't have to be a list, for example. It could be a list, but it could be other things as long as the thing before it is complete and as long as there's a logical relation between the sentences. So in this case, we do get B. 15, all about this pronoun. So it says, as a 2014 study by the KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden found that car travel in Tallinn was down less than 3% since it was enacted. Well, reading it this way, it is very unclear what it is referring to. It as in what? It's just not clear. There's really no antecedent anywhere in the whole sentence what the it is referring to. What it's referring to ultimately is the fare free policy, but there's really no noun in the sentence that makes it clear that that's what it's referring to. And so right away, it and that for the same reason are out. And one, we don't want to use that sort of pronoun. In fact, one is almost always wrong. I don't know if I've ever seen it be right. We're looking for something more specific than that, and that's why we like D. Notice this is a good example of an ambiguous pronoun question, because instead of trying to use a pronoun, the best solution is just throw a noun in there. Let's use the policy instead. It makes it very clear what it was that was enacted and what led to these effects, and we don't have to think about, well, what does this pronoun mean or not mean? It just says it straight away. So sometimes just using the noun is the best option to avoid any sort of ambiguity or vagueness. So here we get D. In this question, we need to see which choice best introduces the paragraph, which means we need to understand what the paragraph is about. So here's a case where we need to see what is going to be relevant to this topic, to this paragraph. This is principle 1. What does it say next? All public transportation systems are subsidized by the government to some extent, but large systems gain a substantial portion of their operating revenue from fares. And then they talk about how systems that go fare-free see increases in ridership, so they must often operate more buses and trains and have more personnel. Advocates of fare-free policies claim that the cost of these policies are largely offset by savings. However, a recent study showed that this outlook is way too sunny, and then it gives an example of some of the costs that come along with it. Okay, so overall, what's this paragraph talking about? Saying that when you institute fare-free policies, more people ride the buses and such, but you lose revenue, and you have to put more service out there for the higher demand, which means your expenses are higher because you're having more buses driving and trains and more drivers and personnel and so on and so forth. And so sort of talking about the economic challenges with doing something like this. And when I look at A, instituting a fare-free system can also have a devastating effect on a city's transportation budget. This seems to be consistent with what the paragraph's talking about. Lower revenue, higher costs, more money out the door when you do this, despite what the advocates say. So, seems like we're leaning towards something like A so far. We'd also want to double check. We look at the previous paragraph, and the previous paragraph is talking about how people thought that doing fare-free public transportation would lead to less driving, but actually it didn't, or at least not that much. And then we have another sort of problem or issue in this paragraph. So I like the word also here and how we're indicating this is like another problem that comes about with fare free. So that's good. Let's check the rest. Also requires planners to make careful considerations about changes in service. They do mention changes in service later, but that's not the main purpose of this paragraph. It's more about the money, the costs. C might also have a negative impact on the environment. Well, they don't really talk about environment here. Also has the drawback of increasing crowding on public transportation. I mean, sort of partially the problem, but overall it's about finances. It's about budgets. That's what gets us A. Looking at 17, we have here a pretty classic comma splice. 2 complete sentences separated by a comma or a couple commas and a however. Remember, however is not one of the fanboys. It cannot be used to separate 2 complete sentences. So we need to fix this, and one way to fix it, as we see in C, is use a comma with a fanboys conjunction, like but. B is still a comma splice. We've gotten rid of the however, but it's still 2 complete sentences separated by a comma. In D, a semicolon could have worked, except then we throw this end in here. And if we're going to use a semicolon, we don't need to use the end. It's sort of like redundant. Either the semicolon or a comma and a conjunction, but not both the semicolon and the conjunction. So we get choice C. For 18, this is all about style and tone. And the problem with way too sunny and some of the other options is they're a little too casual, a little informal, where this passage is more of a formal academic or professional piece of writing. And in fact, I think there's 3 choices that are too informal. It's A, way too sunny, looking too much on the bright side, a little too wordy as well, and then pretty upbeat. All 3 of these are casual, too slangy and informal for this sort of piece. Whereas Overly optimistic, yeah, that's a nice word choice here. Communicates the idea. It's pretty concise. It's appropriate in tone, right? To say that they found this outlook to be overly optimistic, that's the kind of thing you would expect to read in this sort of an article. And so that's why we get D. Which choice provides an accurate interpretation of the chart? So going back to the previous page, it says, for example, in San Francisco, California, so we're looking at San Francisco, public transit was projected to save $8.4 million per year in fare collection costs, but created a deficit of $72 million per year in lost fares. So yeah, the tense of this seems a little bit strange, I have to say. Just trying to back up on this for a minute. So, for example, fare-free public transport was projected to $8.4 million a year, but that's weird. maybe because it's whatever. Tense. With a question like this, even though the tense seems a little bit weird, this is not an issue of grammar. It's an issue of which one best communicates what the chart is trying to say, and which one does that with what makes sense with the paragraph's goal. And the paragraph's talking about how, as this whole paragraph is going into with this example, when you institute fare-free public transportation, it costs you money because you lose revenue and your costs go up. And so I'm looking at A, and I'm pretty happy with A right out of the gate because it is talking about creating a deficit. Now, we go to the chart, though, and the only problem is this. What it says here is not actually what the chart says. The chart says the cost of adding service is $72 million. The deficit, that's not what's discussed here. They don't talk about a deficit. Maybe you could calculate the deficit, but the problem is, this is just not what it says in the graph, and we want to give an accurate interpretation of what's in this chart, so that can't work, even if it does make a kind of sense in context. Save an additional $112 million from lost fares. Just the opposite. We're losing money here. We're not saving money. But result in a total increase of $184 million per year in operating costs. Let's see. That is consistent with the figure, and that does make sense where you're going to save a little money, I guess, here or there, but otherwise you're going to lose a ton of money in all your operating costs and things like that. So that's pretty consistent with the chart, and it makes sense within context. And D is just wrong. You're not saving money. You're spending more money on these costs, on these adding services. So C is the best answer. It makes sense in context for what the paragraph is trying to do, and it is accurate with what the graph is showing. So C. So do we want to add this sentence based on information in the chart? Yes or no? At position 20. We have already given an example of how it costs more money to go fare-free because of your increased operating costs. So let's see the sentence. By contrast, Lane Transit in Eugene, Oregon would lose only $5 million in fares if it instituted a fare-free system. I mean, that is consistent with what the chart says right here. But I don't know, is that really relevant? I mean, we've already given an example, and if anything, this is not... I mean, is it a contrast? I mean, it's only $5 million in fares, but I don't know, that's sort of inconsistent with the paragraph. The paragraph is trying to show examples of when you institute fare-free policies, when you lose money, when your services go up and you actually lose out on the deal. And so this does contrast it, but that's not really what the paragraph is trying to do. We're trying to make the point that it costs more money. And in any event, I mean, it almost doesn't really... it doesn't really go much against the paragraph because it is showing that you're losing money when you do this. It may not be as much as San Francisco, but it's still losing money. So it's not really seemingly effective here. It's not contrasting very well, and it's just almost redundant. We've already given the example we want. And so we can get rid of those two. No, because it does not support the argument that fare-free systems cause a substantial loss for governments. Yeah, I think that makes sense. $5 million is not that much, so it's not substantial. So it does maybe detract a little bit from what the paragraph is trying to do. It definitely doesn't contradict a point made about fare collection. It does say that you are going to lose fares, so that's not contradicted. So best answer here is C. 21, this is about tense. Some college towns and resort communities embrace the model because buses can go faster when drivers blank to collect fares. So looking at this sentence, present tense, embrace, present tense, can, present tense is, present tense is, present tense, anyway. Lots of present tense, so we want to be present tense here. So when drivers would not have had to collect, that's a very awkward, wordy, not present tense phrase. C is past tense, D is future tense. The only one that's present tense is do not have, choice B. So some college towns and resort communities embrace the model because buses can go faster when drivers do not have to collect fares. So there we go. Nice and condensed, present tense. That's our answer. Which choice provides the best conclusion to the passage? So for large cities looking to reduce automobile traffic, though blank. Now the previous sentence does say that fare-free public transportation is maybe a good idea for some college towns and so on. But we can see with this word of contrast that the point going to be made here is that it's not a good solution for large cities. So maybe A. It seems a little bit specific, but hold on to it. Maybe we could go back and see if this research is consistent. But it's a little too specific for a concluding sentence, but we'll hold on to it anyway. Subways will prove to be more important than buses. Well, that doesn't really follow from anything. It doesn't fit within the paragraph. Public transportation should be cheaper but not free. This introduces a different idea that's never discussed. They never talk about, okay, if you don't make it free, maybe you make it cheaper. Seems plausible, but it's just not in the passage. Fare-free public transportation is not the answer. There we go. Right? That's the statement we're looking for. That, okay, it might work for small cities, small towns, certain situations, but when it comes to large cities and their needs and the effect it can have on their budget, as we saw earlier, it's just not really going to be a good idea. So I think we're going to go with choice D more so than A. A is just a little bit too specific. It's not a good summary sentence. And anyway, if we look at that research, when was that research? That was like the traffic one, I think, right? Yeah. Car traffic in Tallinn was down 3%. I mean, okay, it's sort of interesting and relevant, but it's not the main point. The main point we want to show is that it's just not going to be a good idea in general for large cities to institute fare-free public transportation, and that fits best with choice D.